On the Republican side of the race, former President Donald Trump, of course, accepting the Republican nomination last night, not only promising to cut taxes, but also lower inflation.
We have an inflation crisis that is making life unaffordable, ravaging the incomes of working and low-income families, and just simply crushing our people like never before. I will end the devastating inflation crisis immediately, bring down interest rates, and lower the cost of energy. We will drill, baby, drill.
Joining us now, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, American Action Forum President and former Congressional Budget Office Director. Doug, I don't know where we got to unpack some of the stuff that former President Trump was just saying. They're cutting interest rates to slow inflation. I don't know. That sounds a little Turkish to me, but tell me what you made of what former President Trump had to say.
Well, I think if you look at the Trump-Vance economic policy platform, you see some things that are very traditional Republican policy: low taxes, low regulation, a reliance on small businesses, things that you've heard a lot from the Republican Party about over the many, many years. You see some other things that are fairly radical departures, support for lean and con style competition policy, something you probably didn't expect to see. Certainly a continued evolution of the restraint on international trade, his 10% tariff proposal being the most dramatic form of that. So those things are very different. And the promises of the outcomes. We're going to lower inflation and cut interest rates. Well, certainly, if inflation goes back to 2% target, we all know the Fed's going to normalize interest rates. That's to be expected. I think that ball is more in the Fed's camp than it is in the Trump administration's camp if they are elected. The question is, will they actually be supportive of what the Fed's up to? The Biden administration is running $2 trillion deficits at full employment. That's nobody's help for trying to get inflation down and help the Fed. The Trump track record on the budget in his first term was not very good. And he's talking about cutting the corporate rate and not touching Social Security and Medicare. And how does it add up? I think that's the big wild card from the inflation front. We know what the monetary policy is going to be. We haven't a clue what the fiscal position is going to be. And the fiscal position is a really important part of the policy mix on both inflation and the long-term growth.
Doug, you touch on an issue that I think is just so interesting, which is how the Republican Party is changing, Doug. When I was growing up, the Republican Party, it was Reagan and Kemp. It was my dad with his copies of National Review around the house, right? That was the Republican Party. Now, as you touch on, Senator Vance or Hawley or Rubio, you hear it's economic nationalism, it's domestic manufacturing, forget free trade, it's, China is an adversary. Is there a way to sort of bridge these economic views, Doug, traditional conservative and populist conservative?
I think there's a lot of it that really isn't that new. So, go back literally over 20 years, and George W. Bush imposed tariffs on steel products to protect the domestic steel industry. So that's not new. And by the way, it doesn't seem to have worked very well. So, but we see more use of tariffs on the strategic trade side, China being one where I think pretty much everyone has bought into the notion that we're going to use that as a strategic tool against China. What's really different is a 10% across the board tariff proposal. We haven't seen that. Is that something Republicans broadly are prepared to embrace? I think the jury's still out. It seems to me that you need legislation to do that. I know there's some people think you might not. Would that go through the House and the Senate? I think that's a really big question, because that's a $3 trillion tax increase over the next 10 years. How much has the party changed? Will it embrace that?
Well, and I think, Doug, that Josh touches on something interesting here, which is is the Republican Party agenda, particularly on economics, but really across the board, recognizably Republican at this point, or is it just Trumpism? Does it need to be called something else? It seems to be sort of redefined here, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, well, I'm not the communications director, so I think you got the point if we're trying to brand this. As I said, I don't think it's recognizable as traditional Republican policy, but I don't think it's an entirely new brand yet. There are these elements that exist. They reflect something that I think is real and new, and that is a far more inward-facing Republican Party one that is not far more isolationist in its foreign policy views, one that is far less committed to defending freedom around the globe and using the power of the American economy and military to do that. That's really different, and that's really important. A lot of the economic policy changes, I think, are more evolutionary than radical changes, and the question is whether they will survive the next 4 to 8 years or not. The reality is, if you look at the deficits and the debts, you can't do nothing. So far, there's no commitment to doing something, but circumstances are going to force the hand of whoever's governing as much as their policy platform is going to drive it. So we'll see how they react to the circumstances.
When you say circumstances will force it, Doug, what are those circumstances you're mentioning there?
January 1, 2025, the debt ceiling comes back. And suppose Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. Will they casually, easily pass an increase in the debt ceiling or a suspension? Something that all the rating agencies are going to be watching carefully, because the last time we tried to do this, it was a major political football, and there was a downgrade based strictly on the inability of U.S. politics to manage its finances. Will Republicans be able to manage the finances? What happens with funding the government? Probably won't be done by then. What do we do with the 2025 revision to whatever we get out of the 2017 tax cut sunsets? Those are three big, important circumstances that are going to happen in the first year. How will they handle them? Something's going to have to be done in each instance. What will it be?
Doug, literally nobody's talking about this except for you. Not literally
I'm
nobody.
aware of this.
Very few. It's sort of interesting how little people are talking about it, how little voters seem to care. I mean, we were just talking with a strategist earlier who said she's getting a lot of questions from clients about deficits.
I heard that. I was excited.
But I'm sure that you were, but it's not something that's really been talked about. Like, why do you think it's not talked about? Is it just too difficult of an issue to address?
First of all, these are very difficult policy issues. I mean, the centerpiece are Social Security and Medicare, which are 36 out of $71 trillion of non-interest spending over the next 10 years. So that's the bulk of the money. Those two programs, they're complicated, they're important, they're very, very big, and they're growing faster than anything else. So if you want to deal with the U.S. budget outlook, you have to deal with Social Security and Medicare, and both people running for president have said they're not going to touch them. So the reason no one's talking about it is the people at the top have sent the message, we're not doing anything about it. But if the markets wake up and the rating agencies wake up and say, look, you can't even raise the debt ceiling, you can't fund the government, what are you going to do about these really big problems? That's going to change that conversation. They're going to have to come up with real efforts to bring in bring the spending growth down and make things add up.
Doug, thank you so much for joining the show today. Appreciate your time.